All right, today is the next day, the 11th of April, 2026, and I'm going to be looking at the first chapter to Gregory Shaw's Theurgy and the Soul, Neoplatonism of Iamblichus. And it's called, the first chapter, Embodiment in the Platonic Tradition. So we're talking about like a theurgy is essentially a metaphysic that gives a positive view of matter and of the body. And yeah, the invitation is to go back to episodes 2 and 3, where I sort of outline in a fair bit of detail my approach to this and why I feel it's relevant. Again, just to reiterate that I think we need to wake ourselves up and that theurgy is one way to explore how to approach that technically in practice. And I'm hoping that by understanding and studying a little bit more of the tradition of theurgy through the wisdom of Iamblichus, that I can learn about that. Again, this is mostly for my own understanding rather than for anyone else. What I'm going to be doing, since it's a relatively short chapter, is of 7 pages, reading and talking about what I think it means or why it's relevant. So, quote, in his introduction to Egyptian theology in the De Mysteriis, which is a book of his, Iamblichus says, quote, the Egyptians, imitating the nature of the universe and the creative energy of the gods, themselves produce images of mystical insights, hidden and invisible, by means of symbols. Just as nature symbolically reveals invisible measures through visible shapes, and the creative energy of the gods outlines the truth of the forms through visible images. This is quite a complex sentence, and essentially what Iamblichus is getting at is that there are, in sort of the Platonic tradition, forms, right, that are revealed through nature. And when we, through the work of imitation, through demiurgy, imitating the Platonic demiurge, who's kind of like an orchestrating intelligence that gives rise to the cosmos and its patterns. When we imitate that demiurge, we ourselves can produce images and reveal patterns that come to us as a result of what they would call the activity of the gods. And so Iamblichus wrote under a pseudonym of an Egyptian priest, and he, in part of this book of his that we were speaking of, De Mysteriis, gave an exegesis of the symbols and theology of Egyptian religion, which he was quite passionate about. So what he's sort of getting at here is that it's not only the Greek tradition which can be theurgic. Any tradition can be theurgic if it is able to, with religious practice, with specific rites and rituals and a philosophy and so on, allow human souls to, in a sense, resonate with the divine, or what is considered to be divine or sacred. Yeah, so for Iamblichus, as I continue here, the theme of divine mimesis is of central importance for his apology for theurgy. So Iamblichus is trying to justify or give a rational explanation, a philosophical explanation for the pagan rituals and rites, religious practice that was present in his time. And we're going to explore a little bit of what is meant by Platonic demiurgy in that context. So, quote, reverence for Egyptian wisdom was already well established in the Platonic tradition in the 4th century CE, but Iamblichus's Syrian school exhibited an unmatched admiration for their rites and theology. Iamblichus explained that he revered Egyptian theology because it possessed real power, imitating the nature of the universe and the creative energy of the gods. So what he's talking about is that the Egyptian tradition, the Egyptian theological tradition, possesses specific powers. Like what he means is there are particular techniques, particular practices that are involved in Egyptian theology that allow those practitioners, the inheritors of that tradition, to connect with the gods in somewhat of a unique way. Quote, in Platonic terms, this meant taking an active part in the demiurgy of the cosmos and becoming a co-creator with the God of creation. The power and authority of Egyptian rites derive from this cooperative mimesis. Okay, so what he's saying is that when religious practitioners can, through mimesis, through imitation, embody the demiurge, the creator God, then the religious rites and rituals, religious practices that they engage in are, in a sense, more effective, have more power. So, according to Iamblichus, the power and authority of these Egyptian rites, these rites, they embody the eternal ratios, which were the guiding powers of the cosmos. So again, one of the sort of presuppositions underlying this sort of thing is that there is a divine order or harmony, you could say, that we can embody. Quote, the Egyptians, praised by Iamblichus, worshipped the true gods of Platonism, the unchanging patterns of nature. They were a community perfectly integrated with the natural world, reproducing in cult and ritual the activity of the demiurge in the cosmos. It matters that this community, that this style of what is called Egyptian worship here sort of integrates perfectly with the natural world, which is a claim. There's a footnote where A.H. Armstrong contrasts this with Christian practice for whom divine revelation was reserved to a particular social group, with the traditional Hellenes, for whom divine wisdom was universal. Okay, I'll continue there. So basically what Iamblichus is saying here is that there is a particular style of imitation and embodiment of the divine order expressed in the patterns of nature, that when one can resonate with those patterns and embody them and enact them and give expression to them, that one's religious power and authority is grounded in that. Quote, for Iamblichus, Egyptian mysteries represented the highest possible appropriation of the divine in mortal life, and he looked to their rites as a model for the religious rituals he introduced to the Platonic tradition under the name Theurgy, which is a term borrowed from 2nd century Chaldean Platonists. So continuing, theurgical Platonism represents Iamblichus's attempt to introduce the divine mimesis of Egyptian cult to the Platonic community and the Hellenic world. So essentially, it's a way of taking this principle of mimesis that we were talking about and building it into the pre-existing Platonism. It was a contribution that Iamblichus believed was sorely needed by the Greeks because of their obsession with discursive novelties that lacked power and a vital connection to the cosmos. So again, it's pushing back against just theology, just God talk, just dialogue, just rationalistic philosophy. It's wanting to ground it in something real. It comports obviously with Jung. As I continue here, like the Egyptian cult, Theurgy imitated the gods. And Iamblichus said that every theurgic observance was a ritualized cosmogony. Every theurgic observance was a ritualized cosmogony. What that means is that every time there is a theurgic ritual or rite which works, which is effective, in a sense, it gives birth to a world. And when that happens, it endows embodied souls, regardless of their station in life, with the divine responsibility of creating and preserving the cosmos. So there's something about Genesis there. There's something about world building or world creating, literally cosmogonic. And this ends up being a responsibility which is unique to embodied souls, which we are in this metaphysic. So from a theurgic perspective, embodiment itself became a divine service, a way of manifesting the will and beauty of the gods. So this, from this theurgic point of view, that is in a sense the purpose, the reason for embodiment. It's an act of service, service of the divine. Quote, Iamblichus's position irrevocably changed the attitude of Platonists toward embodiment and the physical world. And yet the basis for this change and the central role of theurgy in later Neoplatonism have largely been ignored. If theurgy is understood as cooperative demiurgy, which is essentially imitating or cooperating with, resonating with the Platonic demiurge, then the attitude of a theurgist toward the physical world would be of decided importance. So it's not just about practicing religiously, it's about how we relate to the world itself, the natural world specifically, the physical world. Quote, by sharing in the activity of creation, the theurgist would participate in the ordering of matter, which was the specific function of the demiurge as described in Plato's Timaeus. I think I would just observe there that one doesn't necessarily have to believe in the Platonic demiurge in order to recognize that there is something about our appropriate participation in the ordering of matter. Alchemically, it's kind of an intervention within the rhythm of living substances upon recognition of a certain aliveness and sacredness inherent within matter that I think we can recognize as key, central to human purpose. The reason for our being at all deeply has to do with that kind of participation, that kind of embodying of the creative spirit, particularly in relation to matter and a positive view of it. Quote, one's attitude to the body and matter, then, would be an index of the degree and manner of one's participation in the demiurge. Specifically, Iamblichus held that the worship of embodied souls was determined precisely by their degree of material involvement. So what he's saying is that the way that we relate to our body and to matter are of central importance. They're not a nice to have thing, and they're not secondary in some way. They're crucial. And our attitude to our own body and to matter itself are very revealing of the extent of the effectiveness of our forms of worship, forms of religious practice. If I continue here, quote, the theurgist's highest good was not realized by escaping from materiality, but by embracing matter and multiplicity in a demiurgic way. So not matter and multiplicity sort of simply for its own sake, not down toward anarchy and toward chaos, not down into the mud just to be in the mud, but for the sake of demiurgy, for the sake of connecting with that which is divine. Quote, in this, Iamblichus virtually reversed the symbolic language of his age. Apotheosis in theurgy could no longer be imagined as the ascent of the soul without a corresponding descent and demiurgy. See how deeply Jungian this is, how deeply paradoxical this is. We cannot go up unless we go down first. The pivot on which the metaphor turned was Iamblichus's understanding of the soul's relation to matter. And his solution to this question is critical for understanding the central role he gives to theurgy. Indeed, in the view of Iamblichus and other hieratic Neoplatonists, embodied souls were able to attain salvation only through the theurgic use of matter. Okay, so this is the key point here. The point is a difference of opinion about how we are to attain salvation. How can our souls develop? Iamblichus's viewpoint is through the theurgic use of matter. So out of the soul's relationship with matter, we can practice religiously through rituals and rites, other kinds of practice in such a way that we can, I'll just say, connect with the divine, and leave it at that for the moment. Continuing here, that the soul's ritual use of matter could itself bring about the salvation of the soul was certainly a new development in the Platonic tradition. Yet, despite its apparent unorthodoxy, there are elements in the dialogues, the Platonic dialogues, that lend it support. So we're about to explore how is this rooted in Plato's pantheon, and I would also say we know that Plato and the other important Greeks like Empedocles and Sophocles and Aristotle were all participating in the Greek mystery tradition, drinking some kind of psychedelic or equivalent. And that's essentially what this boils down to. The mystical experience, which can be measured again with the mystical experience questionnaire coming out of Johns Hopkins, the MEC 30. I'm talking about the sacramental basis of the development of the soul in its relationship with matter. And the Greeks were all up in that. But there are other lines of support in, again, what Plato was talking about. Most obviously, the doctrine of Amanesis, which Amanesis is like a deep kind of remembering or waking up to oneself. It's a kind of recollection, which is described here as the core of Plato's epistemology. Quote, in the doctrine of recollection, the soul's education is described as a process of reawakening. So think about this in the context of Plato's cave, right? In that myth, we ascend up and out of the cave and we wake up to an enlightened world. So it's a kind of reawakening or recollection, Amanesis. Here, the soul's education in this Platonic doctrine of Amanesis is described as a process of reawakening by means of contacts with the sensible world. So in relation to this world, and these specific points of contact function as mnemonic prods, which remind the soul of the Platonic forms. So what he's talking about here is that there's a specific Platonic doctrine that involves specific experiences in relation to matter that remind us of that which is higher. Quote, theurgy should be seen as the development and translation of this epistemological theory into a ritual praxis, where the prods of sensate experience were carefully controlled in rites designed to awaken the soul to the forms. While the doctrine of recollection, or Amanesis, lent itself specifically to a theurgic development, the cosmology of the Timaeus provided the necessary framework. So Plato gave us a whole cosmology for this. Quote, without the descent of souls into mortal bodies and the physical appearance of forms, Plato says the work of the demiurge would remain incomplete. The embodiment of the soul and its perfection in theurgy were seen by Iamblichus as essential to cosmogenesis. It's defined as the origin or evolution of the universe. And so what Iamblichus is saying is that the embodiment of our souls and the perfection of the development of those souls in theurgic practice is an essential precondition for the human capacity to create and evolve the universe or universes. So I'm sort of more familiar with that in terms of ideas that have to do with consciousness evolution and collective awakening, but it's not just about our consciousness as in something within me, something in here, right? It's not about that, as I talked about repeatedly. It's also about our extended awareness, our waking up as this combination of self and world, that one way of conceiving of which is cosmogenesis, literally giving birth to new worlds, which is essentially a new way of experiencing reality, life. The idea that this as a ritual religious praxis has a key role to play in human survivability. I'll continue here to finish off the chapter. Although there's evidence in Plato's dialogues that seems to contradict Iamblichus's positive view of matter and embodiment, this conflict is in the dialogues themselves and was the inheritance of any Platonist who attempted to resolve the problem of embodiment. So there are a lot of contradictions that go through Plato, and obviously Iamblichus has taken a specific line through all of that. I'm kind of jumping through some of which I think here is not so important. Yeah, and so in the context of so there are both optimistic and pessimistic views of embodiment outlined in some of Iamblichus's work. So there seem like there are contradictions, but in the context of this problem, theurgy may be seen to bridge the gap between the psychological matter of Phaedo and Phaedrus with their pessimistic view of embodiment and the cosmological matter of the Timaeus, which presents embodiment optimistically. Yeah, so there's a few things which are important here, which I will go through. He's saying that the way to bridge these optimistic and pessimistic views of embodiment is revealed in how Iamblichus gives a solution to the metaphysical problem of the one and the many. What he did was he postulated a middle term, or middle terms. So there's something between the one and the many. So this is a way of talking about the third, the between space, which is talked about in Heidegger. In Christianity, it's essentially the Holy Spirit, as I would understand it. The third. By postulating a middle term or terms, Iamblichus allowed for the continuity between irreconcilable extremes. So there are ways in which embodiment is a profoundly terrible, curse, but there are ways that it's also an essential condition of revelation. And both of those facts are true at the same time. This is what Iamblichus is pointing to. Can we conceive of something between these irreconcilable extremes, whether one and many or positive embodiment and negative embodiment, that allow us to hold both extremes? And so this principle of mediation becomes an integral part of post-Iamblican Platonism. A little bit of a tricky passage there. I'm going to keep going with the last couple of pages. So he says, in the existential situation of embodied souls, Iamblichus's introduction of theurgic rituals provided a mediation between man's experience of matter as an oppressive weight, separating him from the divine, and his innate awareness of matter as the vehicle that joined him with the gods. So what he's saying is that we experience matter as an oppressive weight, which is sort of trapping us within these embodied souls, right? Within embodiment. But we also have this intuition and awareness that matter is also a vehicle for communion with the gods. How can they exist at the same time? Well, theurgy is, in a way, the practical answer to that. As in, quote, theurgy was the dynamic expression of the mathematical mean, establishing a continuity between mortal and immortal realms by allowing embodied souls to enter divine energies through the performance of ritual. Iamblichus solves the Platonic problem of matter and embodiment as a Pythagorean in the tradition of Pythagoras, for he viewed all aspects of creation, however dense, as expressions of the primary and divine principles. Paras apion, limit and unlimit. Theurgic rites allowed the soul to enter these measures directly, ritually enacting divine principles whose power was shared by all those who embodied them. Just finishing off here. So Iamblichus' solution to this problem must also be seen in the context of the late 3rd and 4th centuries and the increasing popularity of religions of radical dualism exemplified in Gnosticism, Manichaeism, and to some degree Christianity. Yeah, and so the question of the value of life in a body and the status of the physical world had become highly charged issues on which often depended the salvation or damnation of one's soul. So it's a central issue. It's not a sidebar. It's not a tangent. It's centrally important. What is the value of this life? What is the value of this body? What is the status of this world in which we live? Basically determines whether or not our souls are to be saved or damned in Christian terms. Quote, in this light, it was not Iamblichus as Platonic scholar and mathematician that attracted the adulation of his successors. It was Iamblichus as savior, who revealed mysteries that transformed the suffering and weight of material existence into a foundation for communion with the gods. The body as tomb, quote, riveted to the soul by sense experience, became the vehicle through which the soul found its proper limits. The vehicle through which the soul found its proper limits, thereby saving itself and becoming liberated while still in a body. Thus, matter and the soul's use of matter played an indispensable role in theurgy, as it did in cosmogony. The soul could no more realize its salvation without embracing matter than the demiurge could create the cosmos without the formless receptacle that gave expression to the forms. Okay, so in the same way that what he's sort of talking about is that the Platonic demiurge, who's again conceived as this orchestrating or conducting intelligence, finds a state or a quality of being a perfect receptacle or the vessel, the void, and it's from out of that condition that that demiurge gives expression to the forms. And in the same sort of way, the soul can imitate the demiurge in its own cosmogonic function, and in so doing, realize its own salvation by embracing matter. Because there's a connection there between that matter and that void or vessel that I was mentioning. They're connected with the archetype of the Great Mother and also the archetype of the number 4, which I will talk about at a different point. Quote, the difference, however, is that while the soul's embrace of matter was piecemeal, following the cycles of time, the act of the demiurge on matter was simultaneous and complete. And it's precisely in this difference that Iamblican theurgy must be understood. Okay, so we're going to explore that in quite some detail further on, but I'll just leave that there for the moment. So what he was just pointing to is that there's a difference between what the demiurge is up to in Platonic terms and what we are up to as embodied souls that has to do with how much we can embrace matter and whether or not we follow the cycles of time. There's a quote, at this point, we should bear in mind that Iamblichus' term for matter was coined by Aristotle, who said that Plato's material principle, which was called space, receptacle, mother, nurse, was equivalent to hyle. I understand it to be pronounced hyle. I'm not sure. Quote, this is from Aristotle. The receptive space of Plato's Timaeus is the same as matter. Hyle or hule. I think it's hyle though, which is a term originally meaning wood or timber. So it's kind of that which one builds with in a way. And henceforth it became a technical philosophical term used by Platonists to refer to matter, hyle. So these are all different terms, but we're going to talk about hyle in some detail later on that has to do with the quality of the receptacle or the receptive, the mirror glass in Jung. It's the void, the vessel, space itself, the mother, the nurse, matter. I think of also the body and the unconscious in this context. Like most Neoplatonists, Iamblichus believed Aristotle and Plato were essentially in agreement, and he translated many of Aristotle's theories about the physical world to the intelligible. Yep, and so Aristotle's influence on Iamblichus remained terminological and to some degree structural, for his meanings were transformed entirely in Iamblichus's theurgical Platonism. And that will quite do in terms of this foray into embodiment in the Platonic tradition through Iamblican theurgy with Gregory Shaw, Theurgy and the Soul Neoplatonism of Iamblichus. And I'll return to chapter 2, matter as a cosmic instrument at some point.